Sanjay, let's start with positive news, the vaccine. Moderna said early results show that people in this study developed antibodies against the virus. So explain to us what that means.
Yeah, I mean, this is encouraging news, Jake. This is a whole new different kind of vaccine. What they did was they took a blueprint of a little piece of the virus, and they used that essentially to inject into the body. The body then creates this piece of the virus over and over again, and the body makes antibodies to it, okay? That's a little bit hard to understand maybe, but this is a whole new different kind of vaccine. In the past, Jake, you take a little piece of the virus and give that to try and elicit an antibody response. This is brand new. We didn't know if it was gonna work. I mean, this is, we're seeing the results now for the first time together, and what we're seeing is that when they gave even the lowest doses of this vaccine, the body, the people who got the vaccine, did make antibodies, and they made antibodies at the same level as if they had become infected. So when you get infected, you make antibodies. When you get a vaccine, you make antibodies. This seems to be the same now with the amount of antibodies. You gave more vaccine, you got even more antibodies. Now, I'll just explain this. When you actually put the antibodies and the virus in a test tube together, those antibodies then seem to neutralize the virus, which is what you want to see, that neutralizing activity. Is it actually going to have an impact on the virus? And the answer seems to be yes. These are early studies, very, very early data, Jake, but this is proof of concept. And you know, I've never seen this work before. The investigators haven't seen it work before in humans. So if this carries out, I mean, that could potentially be some good news.
Yeah, potentially fantastic news. So that's phase one. What are the next steps as Moderna looks to go to phase 2 and then phase 3 in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, let me show you the timeline quickly, because this is at the heart of all the discussions, right? When might this be available? Phase 2 was already announced. They already knew they were going to go into phase 2. That's going to be larger trials. They're going to do that through sort of the end of the summer or beginning of July sort of time frame. If that still seems to show these results, where you have these signals of efficacy, then they're going to start going into phase 3 trials sort of by the end of summer or early fall. I mean, the timeline's a little loose there. And each time you go into a new phase, Jake, you're incorporating more and more people, and you're trying to get a sense of what is the right dose, who are the right populations of people that are going to most benefit from this, elderly, children, people in between, people with pre-existing conditions. Might there be booster shots that are necessary? These are all the sorts of questions I want to sort of answer. Important thing, Jake, and you and I have talked about this, but the U.S. government is going to make a bunch of gambles. They're probably going to look at this vaccine from Moderna, a few others, and they're going to just go ahead and start manufacturing this even before those phase 3 results come in. That's what we heard from this Operation Warp Speed press announcement. It's a gamble because it costs a lot of money to do that, but the reason you do it, Jake, as you might guess, is then you have the vaccine available.
Does this make the vaccine timeline, theoretically, that we could have something in 12 months, 18 months, that timeline that we've heard Dr. Fauci and others say, does it make it seem more likely?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess what Dr. Fauci has said since January, since the beginning of all this, when they started working on the vaccine, was 12 to 18 months. He's always, you know, it's always a loose time frame, but 12 months would obviously be January of next year. 18 months would be the summer of next year. I mean, it's, I guess, possible to start being able to vaccinate people by early next year if this still goes forth. Again, this is very early data, but if it continues to have this sort of efficacy, this sort of effectiveness, you could have some people start to get vaccinated by early next year. Probably those would be healthcare workers, people who are at great risk, and then you start to gradually increase the population of people who get vaccinated. I think the question will be, how long does it take for the vaccine to kick in? For example, with this study, it was about 43 days when you started to see enough antibodies to start neutralizing the virus. So, you know, what is that, a month and a half? So you have to think about, does someone need a booster shot at that point? There's all these considerations, is my point, Jake. But yes, is the answer to the question. Early next year, spring, summer, around that time frame is conceivable.
Well, let's talk about side effects, because Moderna said that there are some side effects, including a fever in certain patients. How concerning is that?
Yeah, one of the things that the NIH came back to Moderna with early on and said, you know, in addition to testing this vaccine, we want you to start doing various dosing trials. So they're doing everything from 25 micrograms to 250 micrograms. That's 10-fold difference. We actually interviewed one of the participants who received the 250 microgram, and exactly what you said. He had fever, he had sort of malaise, did not feel well for a couple of days, he said, and then recovered and felt fine at the time that we talked to him, which was a couple of weeks after he received that second shot. The first shot he felt fine with. It was the second shot that caused these symptoms. That's going to be a question mark, and keep in mind that most of these trial participants are, you know, pretty healthy people otherwise. What happens when you give it to people with pre-existing conditions, people who are elderly? That is the whole dosing regimen that sort of needs to be figured out here, because it might be different for certain people. Certain people may need to get smaller doses and then a booster and so forth.
And of course, we need to continue addressing this with humility, given how little we know about this and why it kills some people and not others. So I want to, before you go, I want to ask you about this piece you wrote for CNN.com called "If the United States Were My Patient." A really interesting piece, and you write, quote, "We have been infected and we are only partway through the miserable therapy. If we stop now, however, it may not just be back to square one. We may be worse off than we started. The metaphorical resistant bacteria may be unleashed." Explain what you mean by that. Why do you think we could be worse off?
There was 2 points. You know, keep in mind, Jake, when we started the pause in this country, sort of encouraging people to start staying at home in the middle of March, there were some 80 people who had died at that point and around 4,500 people who'd been infected. And it was enough of a concern at that time to say we need to initiate these stay-at-home measures. It seems a little hard to understand why now, when we have as many people as you see on the screen there infected and as many people who've died, now we're saying it is time to reopen. The virus hasn't changed. It's still out there. It's still contagious. My concern is that if you have that many people who are infected and you start to open things up, you could start to get significant clusters, even more so than at the beginning of when we started this whole process. By the way, I should just clear. You know, the bacteria is obviously treated by an antibiotic. This is a virus. But the point I was making there was that if you give an antibiotic therapy, you're always told to take the full course, right? If you stop halfway through, then sometimes what you do is you kill the easy to kill bacteria, and the hard to kill bacteria remain. They start to replicate, and the infection overall becomes harder to kill. I was trying to draw a metaphor there, but I was in the hospital taking care of patients over the weekend, thinking about how do I have these conversations with patients, and realizing that over the last few months, it's been a very similar conversation about what's happening in the country. So I thought, you know, to sort of humanize this a little bit for people, to make them understand why this therapy is necessary, why we have to be diligent and thorough with it, I thought I would draw on this example of the country as a body.